Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here, at least digitally. Today's talk is going to be about a paradigm shift in understanding what the business model actually is, where we've been wrong for over a century. I'm going to share with you a new KPI that will totally change the way you think about your business. It will expose just how incorrectly we have been thinking about our businesses, and it will reveal innumerable solutions to your problems that have been hidden from view up until now. There is something wrong with the business model. I'm going to show you here on this chart. We've collected data from on key performance indicators from Baker Tilly, which is certainly the greatest uh, accounting firm and consulting firm for the restaurant trade, especially independents. If we look here, what we're seeing is the data for 2016, 17, and 18 before COVID hit. And what we see is that each year, the EBITDA is going down. EBITDA is EBITDA plus rent added in. 11.7% full service restaurants in 2016, down to 11% in 2017, down to 10.7% in 2018. EBITDA, for those of you who don't understand it, EBITDA is one measure of cash flow, one measure of profitability. It's the EBITDA stands for earnings, but we add back into that interest payments, tax payments, depreciation, and amortization. The B means before. So the earnings before we take away interest payments, tax payments, depreciation payments, and amortization. The EBITDA adds an R to the end. Now, we use EBITDA traditionally to be able to assess one business next to the other on a sort of apples to apples basis. Some people, especially in the restaurant industry, like to add the rent also in because you may have a restaurant that signed a lease at the top of the market. Maybe it's paying $80 a square foot, but 2 years later, there was a market crash, and maybe you're only paying $40 a square foot on your second restaurant. So by adding those back in, you're not punishing the management team for something they had no control over, which is when that lease was signed. Nonetheless, it's quite alarming that EBITDA, including rent now, is only 10.7%. So because we have to understand what happens when you add the rent back in. And here we're showing it. If the rent is only 5%, and we subtract that from 10.7% EBITDA, then we're showing an EBITDA of 5.7%. Okay. If we're 6%, it's 4.3, 2.7. If we're paying 10% rent, which most people today are, then that means the average restaurant in America was only producing 0.7% profit on sales. What's worse is the cost of capital. Whether you're using your own savings or whether you're using borrowed money or investor money, there's a concept called the weighted average cost of capital. And before COVID hit, we could say that the weighted average cost of restaurant capital was generally about 7%. And it was usually half debt and half equity. The equity is always more expensive than the debt. Another very important metric here is the sales to investment ratio. That means at 0.9%, the average restaurant costs almost as much to make as 1 year's annual sales. So if you're making less than 1% return on 1 year's sales almost as your investment, it shows that the return on invested capital is horrific. Here, on this line here, the bottom line in red, we're showing what happens when you take this return on invested capital and then you subtract from it the weighted average cost of capital, and you will see that even those restaurants that have only 5% rent were actually having a very negative return on invested capital once you subtract the weighted average cost of capital. And even in the case where hypothetically, if money was 3, it's still a dreadfully low return. So, yes, I think that answers the question. Of course, the years of COVID were far worse. Now things are getting back to normal. So, the statement is true. There is something wrong with the business model. And what do we mean by the business model? Most people stop at the level of goods, services, distribution, etc. But I invite you to look much deeper. You know, we have things called mental maps, mind maps. And one of the most important things to learn is that the map is not the territory. We often say that intelligence is the ability to make models that represent reality. Now, the model is not reality, neither is the map the territory. It is an approximation of reality. The fidelity of the model rests primarily upon the truthfulness of its first assumptions. If any of those first assumptions are false, then the model is unlikely to represent reality accurately. The business model that we examine is the financial model we've all been using, which was hastily chosen for us by the finance community in response to the creation of the federal income tax. Here we go. The standard pricing formula for business is the selling price equals the fixed cost plus the variable cost plus profit. Now, in a restaurant, variable cost is your cost of goods sold, typically. The fixed cost is essentially everything else. We'll get to that. I'll justify that later. And so the selling price is usually we want to make the profit a fixed percentage of the selling price. So typically we'll combine fixed cost and variable cost and multiply that times 1 plus the profit percentage. In other words, 1.2% here. Okay. Now, the accountants decided to use a completely different model for us. They used basically the retail store model. What differs in this model is that whereas everyone else assesses a nominal fixed expense per transaction, instead, we simplify it and we just take a fixed percentage, say 35% of the sale to account for labor costs and a different fixed percentage of the sale to account for overhead. And overhead is defined as every other expense besides cost of goods and labor cost. Okay. So here's an example. The cost of goods of a pasta, $3, chicken, $5, steak, $10, rack of lamb, $15. We're pricing it according to the industry standard by marking up times 3. This would be like a French restaurant, fine dining. That gets you 9, 15, 30, and 45. When you subtract the cost of goods from the menu price, that gives you what's called gross margin, $6, $10, $20, and $30 here. Now, we have elected to say we're going to allocate 50% of the gross margin towards labor, $3. 50% of 10 is 5, 50% of 20 is 10, 50% of 30 is 15. And we're going to do 40% in this case, these are hypotheticals, 40% for the overhead. So 40% of 6 is 240, of 10 is 4, of 20 is 8, and of 30 is 12. And therefore, the total expenses are the combination of these. And so we end up with net operating income theoretical of 60 cents, $1, $2, and $3. But does this reflect reality? So let's do a thought experiment. Imagine a restaurant that does a single seating a night, has 100 chairs, and it has those same 4 items on the menu. And one night, who can explain it? We say in theoretical physics, if it's theoretically possible, given enough time, It will happen. And so here it happened. One night, 100 customers all ordered the pasta. Some other night, they all 100 customers ordered chicken. Yet some other night, all ordered the steak, and yet some other night, all ordered the rack of lamb. The question here is, do these differences, these different nights, have any difference in their labor or overhead? And the answer should be obvious to you that there is no difference. You need to staff exactly the same number of people because you don't know what they're going to order. You're ready to do all 4 of the dishes. And the overhead doesn't change based upon what they order. So, as a matter of fact, we need to think of labor and overhead as fixed expenses in general. Now, this is the reality. Instead of the labor expense being this is what shows you what happens when we take the conventional model up top. It predicted 60 cents, $1, $2, and $3 of profit. But that's not really what's happening, because the reality is that the labor is the same no matter what the customer orders, and it is about at the 80th percentile of the high-priced items in most restaurants. It varies a small amount, but in a given Bayesian curve, it's way up there towards the upper limits. So in this case, we're going to assume that it was around $18. Doesn't matter whether the person orders the pasta, chicken, steak, or lamb. The fixed expense of labor and overhead is $18 in this particular restaurant model. So what it ends up really meaning is when you add the cost of good and the entire fixed, the true cost of the pasta is $21. We're selling it only for $9. We're losing 133% on that dish. The chicken, we're losing $8 or 53%. The steak, we're making a little bit of money. We're making 6.7%. And the rack of lamb, we're making a whopping 26.7% profit. However, the problem is most of our sales come from these 2 less expensive items. This leads to an aggregate loss of money on food sales. Okay. So the standard model fails to account. Now, why do we lose so much money on food? The single business fallacy is the greatest explanation of this. The standard restaurant business model that the finance people came up with is conceptually false. It does not reflect reality. This causes us to misprice every single food item and every single beverage item. You see, it treats them the same. It also unintentionally creates a perverse incentive schema that rewards bad customers, I put that in quotations, and punishes good customers. I simply mean our failed pricing formula causes us to lose money on certain customers. It's not their fault, it's our fault. And we make rapacious amounts on certain other customers, but in reality, the customers we make money on are getting punished. The customers we're losing money on are actually being subsidized by the other customers. So the single business fallacy is simply this, that we can treat food sales and beverage sales the same. But this is not at all true. You see, we only retail beverages, but we manufacture food. Now, here's a thought experiment. Here's a typical American restaurant today making only 1% net operating income. Cost of good food, 35, cost of good beverage, 25, labor, 45, including taxes and benefits, overhead, 24%. And this is a restaurant that is 50% food, 50% beverage, 5 and 5. And you'll see what the costs are. The cost of food is 1.75 million, 1.25 million on the beverage, 4.5 million on the labor, 2.4 million on the overhead. That's a total of 9.9 million of expense, leaving $100,000 of profit on 10 million of sales. Okay. Now, what would happen if for some reason this restaurant lost its liquor license for 1 year? Maybe the alcohol commission did an audit and the bartenders weren't carding the young people enough. And they wanted to make an example. What would that happen? What would happen to the bottom line? Well, here we go. You would lose isn't in expenses only the beverage cost. You really wouldn't even lose 1 penny of labor or overhead. In fact, when you think about it, all of your wait staff, which relies upon tips for most of their income, their total income is going to fall by almost half. You're going to have a hard time retaining your staff unless you subsidize their wages during this 1 year when they don't have alcohol sales. But look at the reality here. You just lost the alcohol sales. The only expense that is cut is the cost of goods of alcohol. And you go from a positive 1% profit to negative 73% profit. They also understand why it is. But this thought experiment basically shows you that when we are in this position with when we manufacture food, all of the expense goes to labor. All of the labor expense goes to labor. Pretty much all of the overhead goes to all of the labor expense goes to manufacturing the food and goes to, in other words, if you were to think of it this way, if you have the 100 people come into that restaurant and 100 of those people, all of them order nothing but tap water, versus night number 2, all of those people come in and they all have bottles of wine. Did you need 1 additional man hour of labor in the second scenario? And the answer is no. You already staffed. The staffing you have, the alcohol sales are purely incremental, meaning they are optional. Everyone comes into the dining room is going to sit and have something to eat. So in order to feed anybody, you need all of your staff, front of the house, back of the house. But the alcohol sale is purely discretionary. This is why, if we were to understand that we manufacture food and merely retail beverage, we would allocate all of the labor to the manufacturing of food. It wouldn't be 45% labor cost on the food. It's actually 90%. We would allocate all of the overhead to the manufacturing of food. It's not 25% or 24%, it's 50%. And when you add this up, you realize that you're losing 75% on your food sales, but none of those fixed costs really are required for the additional beverage sales. So that's running at a 75% profit. Think about this for a moment. You have 2 completely different businesses under one roof. They're not even from the same industry. One of your businesses hemorrhages money, loses 75%. The other one rakes in the money. And this is all because, so whether you make money or lose money has much more to do with your sales mix ratio than anything else. As long as you have a lot of volume, plenty of turns. It's just remarkable to think that you do all the work putting out this incredible food, everything that can go wrong. But the reality is that that profit center of manufacturing food is running at a 75% loss or greater. And this is all because we simply took the retail store financial model from the finance community, no critical thinking, no disputation. We simply took it hook, line, and sinker. The results of it are catastrophic. The next and extraordinarily important thing is to understand the geographic penalty for hospitality, for restaurants. This is because, especially in the arena of fine dining, unlike Europe, where fine dining is a single seating service, the table is yours the whole night. They do not turn tables. I don't even think it's started yet. But notice in America, we turn the tables. When I was the chef de cuisine Boulet, we had 80 seats, and we did 80 from 5:30 to 7, another 80 from 7 to 8:30, another 80 from 8:30 to 10, another 80 from 10 to 11:30, every single night, Monday through Sunday, if we were open. Every single night. Well, this shows what happens. Now, this chart assumes a 50-50 sales mix of alcohol and food. Notice we're assuming $100 of food sale per person, $100 of beverage sale per person. In Manhattan, and when I say Manhattan, I mean the best locations of Manhattan. Not every location in Manhattan, but the best location, because you could move a good restaurant up the Upper West Side and lose a final night seating because it just goes to sleep up there much earlier. But in the great locations, you will do 100% occupancy for 4 complete seatings a night as a 3-star Michelin restaurant. A bistro like Balthazar might do 10 seatings in a night. 4 o'clock to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, 7 to 8, 8 to 9, 9 to 10, 10 to 11, 11 to 12, 12 to 1, 1 to even 2. So here we have $80,000 of sales, 100 people times $200 times 4 seatings, 80,000. And the prime costs come to 62.5%, add overhead of 25%, and you're running at 12.5% profit, theoretical. Nobody's perfect, so maybe you do 10% profit. All you need to do is move to a second-tier city or a lesser desirable location in Manhattan itself, and now you lose that final seating and you're essentially at break even. 73% prime cost, 98.3% overall, theoretical, meaning you're breaking even if you're a genius. Now you get to the urban-suburban border. You're getting only 2 seatings a night because people are commuting. They can't get there for the first seating. They're commuting. They won't stay for the late one. And now you're at a 20% loss with perfect management. Suburban, forget about it. 185% cost with perfect management, meaning you're losing 85% a day with perfect management. You need to be bonusing your managers at 85% loss. Here's what the truth is, though. In the suburbs, you're down to 30% alcohol, 70% food, because everybody's worried about DWIs and on and on and on. And in this case, basically, with only 30% alcohol, even the Manhattan restaurant, if it had that low an alcohol sale, would probably be just breaking even. The suburban restaurant would be losing 130% with perfect management. And this has so much to do with this nonsensical business model of treating the business, pricing the business as if beverages and foods are identical, instead of recognizing that we manufacture food and merely retail beverage. And because of this horrible pricing model, this mistaken, this model that does not reflect reality, if you're in the rural center like when I opened my Ryland Inn, to just stay alive, had to do the same number of covers per seating, but with 1/13 the amount of labor in the front, 1/13 the amount of labor in the back, meaning for a long time, three-star Michelin restaurants have had basically one employee per chair in the dining room. And in Europe, it's a lot more than that, maybe two employees total per chair in the dining room. When I was at El Bulli, it was close to, I think we had as many employees in the kitchen as chairs in the dining room. I forget that for sure, but it was certainly my impression. So that means if you had a 250 seat restaurant like my Ryland Inn was, if it was in the city, you would have 250 total employees, roughly half and half, front and back. But to do that in the suburbs, you would have to take 250 employees, and then you would divide that by 13, and you'd be left with 20, essentially. You know, it's in order for your labor cost. So, in other words, it's a very, very defeating thing to say that you can just simply cut your cost, your labor cost, even to the level of business volume you have. This is another great fallacy. This idea that the business model, the number one problem in America is the geographical problem, meaning that the owners took an urban business model and did not adjust it to the economic realities of its location. They wanted to do a Jean-Georges type restaurant, but they wanted it in their suburban backyard so they could hold court. And they were expecting the same types of financial results when you're getting only one seating a night, if you're lucky, on average. It's probably even less than that, rather than 4 complete seatings a night as a 3-star Michelin, or two seatings a night as a bistro when a New York City restaurant would get 10. The most important thing to understand here is it doesn't really take any more labor to do one seating, to do 5 seatings, than to do 1 seating or 2 seatings. It's just that you're keeping your people are staying maybe a little bit longer, but it's almost no additional labor expense. It's de minimis to go from 1 seating to 2, or 2 to 3, 3 to 4. It's an enormous problem. So the key takeaway is that fixed expenses in U.S. restaurants average 50 to 75% of the total sale. But whether you can get your fixed expenses down that low depends far less on cost control, but far more on delivering multiple seatings. We've all been trained that management equals cost control labor, cost control food, cost control beverage. I'm about to show you why that reasoning, although it's a necessary step in your development as a business owner or a business manager, it is in fact wildly wrong in almost all cases. Those exceptions being those tiny few restaurants that are in the A+++ locations in certain international cities that get the maximum number of turns per night of all restaurants of their type in America. So I developed a brand new KPI that I think is the single most important thing to look at any restaurant, especially restaurants that need turning around. And I call it the fixed expenses per chair per day, or FECD. Let's take this theoretical restaurant. It's based on a real restaurant in Manhattan. It does 10 million a year in sales. 5 million is food and 5 million is beverage. It has a profit of 10%, or 1 million. Therefore, its total expenses are 9 million. Cost of goods, average 30%. It was 35% for food, 25% for beverage. That blends together as 30% total, or 3 million here. When we subtract the 3 million of cost of goods from total expenses, that leaves us $6 million of what I call fixed expense. That expense is fixed because it will not change even 1 penny, whether the customers order no alcohol or the most expensive bottles there are. That number will not change depending on what the client orders to eat. We take that 6 million, which is the annual fixed expense, and we divide it by the days of operation, number of days of operation. Let's say 300 here. Let's say they're closed 1 day a week. You close on Sunday, hypothetically, and maybe another 13 days for closing, vacation, annual, whatever. This came out to $20,000 a day. Now we divide by the number of chairs. And this particular restaurant had 150 chairs, and it is emblematic. It is totemic of a certain mid-tier level of fine dining. Notice this number, $133.33 of fixed expense per chair per day. That's an alarming number. Now, you can calculate that for any restaurant that has been in operation for over a year. You could simply say, what are my total sales? You put it up there. What is my profit, if any? You add it or subtract it, proportionally. If you have a profit, you'll subtract it from the sales. If you have a loss, you'll add it. And that will give you your total expenses. And then you just subtract from that your cost of goods. And then you divide it by the number of days you were open, and you'll have a number. And I've seen them from $30. I've seen them all the way to more than this, over $200. The implication of this is that pricing and profitability is most highly correlated with the number of turns a restaurant does, not with cost controls. Let me show you what I mean. Let's take that same restaurant and say, okay, what do we need to charge for a hamburger in order to break even? Not even making money, just to break even. Now, if we have situated this restaurant in some rural or suburban area where we only get a single seating on average, that means if we had 150 chairs and we're open 6 nights, that means we averaging 900 people a week. We would need to charge, remember, the formula for price is fixed cost plus variable cost plus profit. We're setting the profit at 0. So if we only do 1 seating, we need to charge $140 for a hamburger to break even on that customer if all he does is eat. With 2 seatings, $74. 3 seatings, $52. 4 seatings, $41. 5 seatings, $34. 6 seatings, $29. 26, 24, and not until we get to 10 seatings do we get to a price that customers will even tolerate, $20.33. This shows you that the number one problem of almost all restaurants in America is they're not doing enough turns. And they can't because they're not in the A+++ locations. You see, what you have to understand is that pricing is set in Manhattan and other international cities that get the greatest number of turns. So a bistro in Manhattan does 10 turns. It can sell that hamburger for $20, no problem. Even if that customer had nothing to drink, just tap water, they still don't lose money on that customer. But you take the same Balthazar and you put it out in any suburb, it's not going to do 10 seatings. It might only do 4. You can't simply double the price of every menu item. You can't simply go from 20 to 40. Okay, that's one implication. That the number one cause of restaurant failure is location. And I have seen restaurants that put out absolute crap and the service is horrific. And yet the businesses laugh all the way to the bank. They've got extraordinary locations. And I've seen thousands of restaurants that put out fine food, some of them even extraordinary food, some of them with extraordinary service. And all they ever do is hemorrhage money. They lose money their entire lifespan because they do not do enough turns. Now, the implications of this are immense. You've been taught to manage food, manage labor to a cost percentage. We got to make the labor at 35 or whatever your number is. We got to make it 35%, and you spend all week long sweating over every single man hour of labor you have. Okay. Let me say, for an example, you're in a location and you're a bistro, and your pricing isn't set by you and your conditions. The pricing you're able to charge was set by restaurants in Manhattan or Chicago or Houston. These big international cities that get the maximum number of turns. They have the maximum heterogeneity, different kinds of people. They've got the people who come in at 5 p.m. to eat dinner. They have the people who come in at 1 o'clock in the morning for dinner. All these different types of lifestyles, all these different ethnic groups, all with a different culture. And some of them, as we well know, some of the Spanish community, some of the people in Spain, don't even think about dinner until past 9 p.m. when it gets cooler over there. Okay. So my point I'm trying to say is your pricing in your restaurant was not set by your business realities. The price you can charge was set by someone in an international city. And this is a huge problem. So there are ways around this. I wouldn't even bring up all this problem just to make everybody feel despair. But it opens the door to an entirely new way of thinking. For example, supposing I'm doing really high-end fine dining, and right now I can only charge the same, or maybe not even as much as that New York City restaurant on the same tier. But what can I now do? I could say right now I'm getting only 1 seating. Okay. I'm managing my costs like it's unbelievable. But you have to start to think of it a different way. If I have only 1 seating, my fixed cost in this case is $133. What if I could get just 1 more seating somehow? Okay. And we'll talk about that at another time. There are different logistical things you can do. There's the way you run your kitchen. There's the way you run your floor. But I want to talk about the labor component here first, because every restaurant I've ever been in, the management is proud of the fact that they run the team so lean. And the reality is, when you understand that your number one problem is the number of turns you don't have, you begin to realize that's exactly the wrong thinking. Instead, you should be saying, you know what, I'm going to hire 2 people whose only job is to build another seating. Let's call it happy hour. Okay. And they're going to get, a modest salary, but they're going to get a big bonus if they deliver. I want 150 asses in those chairs in happy hour. You tell me what value proposition, what unique selling proposition, what level of, what kind of promotional we need. That's your job. Go get it. And, by the way, I'm going to hire another 2 people whose only job, they don't work, they don't, not waiters. These are people who are, they have one single mission: deliver me a late night seating. Make that a second, make a late night seating. Now, do you have to perhaps discount? Do you have to bundle? Do you have, whatever things you might have to do? You'll come up with a plan and we'll work it. And maybe I'm going to hire another two guys or one guy whose only job is to give me two seatings by speeding up the kitchen, speeding up the service in that narrow window of time from 6:30 to maybe 8, when suburban people will actually dine. So that there's the kitchen never gets in the shits. There's an extra amount of labor in that kitchen that you can allocate. We run it with the cue boards. We make sure that we have set the menu to operate where every appetizer takes the same 3 minutes to execute, every entree the same 7 minutes, every dessert the same 2 minutes, and no one is rushed, but there is never a wait, and the kitchen never, ever, ever falls behind those times, not by more than 10 seconds. Otherwise, that labor is deployed. These are the kinds of things that can transform by adding the correct kind of labor, not taking it away. You can never, ever, ever cut your way to profitability when you're in a location that's delivering you fewer seatings than the industry leaders. Sometimes you have to add expense in order to make profit. Now, I want everybody to understand that I am not here to bash anything that anyone, any consultant has ever said. There's a place for everything at each stage of development. Everything that we consultants talk about, such as KPIs, keeping your food cost percentage in line, keeping your labor cost percentage in line. These all have extraordinary value at certain points of your development. It's a lot like mathematics. You can't bypass algebra and go straight to calculus. What I teach is extremely advanced, and not everyone is ready for it. If you struggled following this today, do not worry. File these notes away. I will put this on my YouTube channel so you can have the full presentation at another time. And come back to them when you have fluency in food cost, when you have fluency in labor cost, when you know how to read a P&L statement and you understand the basics of finance. This information will be waiting for you. We will explore in tomorrow's module called Menu Maestros, crafting a profitable menu for tomorrow. I will outline a whole slew of strategies on how to use this insight in order to create a menu that does the opposite of what the standard model pricing does. This enlightened pricing model actually rewards good customers rather than punishing them. This enlightened model actually can take a restaurant from 1% sales to from 1% operating profit to as much as 30% operating profit while cutting the price of alcohol in half. And I know it sounds magical or impossible, but it has worked every place I've tried it. At any rate, it has been a great delight presenting to all of you and to all of my dear friends who are on the panel and giving presentations. I salute you, and especially my dearest friend, Donald Burns, the restaurant coach. He has the information. If any of you wish to contact me, I'd be delighted to help you out. Thank you very much.